We say Tehillim all the time, in moments of fear, hope, and gratitude. But have you ever stopped to ask, what makes Tehillim so powerful? We've all been told these words are holy, that they carry unique spiritual weight, that they were written with divine inspiration. But why? What is it about these words that has made them a cornerstone of Jewish life for thousands of years? That's the question the podcast Tehillim Unveiled sets out to explore. Each episode takes one of the most familiar chapters and unpeels it layer by layer, revealing its structure, emotion, and timeless meaning. In the latest episode, Dr. Yael Ziegler joins the show to explore how Tehillim captures the heartbreak of Tisha B'Av and the quiet hope that follows. Tehillim Unveiled. Find the link in the description of this podcast.
We are touching and connecting to people who otherwise would have no contact with the Jewish tradition, and we are drawing those close specifically. And in that context, why is a nice Jewish boy like me involved in that? Because it's one of the most noble missions a Jew could be involved with. I mean, you're opening up the opportunity and the potential for someone who is perhaps disconnected from their tradition, either because they've had a bad experience or because their parents were never connected and they never had the opportunity. And you're the one who's going to open that door for them? I mean, how could you not be involved in such a noble task?
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Kiruv, or Jewish outreach, has a mixed reputation. While it can be a wonderful endeavor, in the wrong hands it can lead to emotional blackmail, objectification, and an unhealthy teacher-student power imbalance. Even Kiruv in the right hands and with pure motivations raises important questions. Rabbi Simi Lerner has given extensive thought to them, and today he and I talk about what Kiruv should be and in what ways it sometimes goes off the rails. We discussed his philosophy of outreach, the reasons that outreach is important, and what an honest person involved in Kiruv should try to achieve. We also talked about the issues associated with the idea of a Kiruv professional, Kiruv institutions and their inevitable reliance upon metrics, and what dangers can result from problematic Kiruv methods. For me, the most intriguing part of our conversation was centered around the question of what a Kiruv rabbi or rabbinite should do if encouraging greater mitzvah observance in one way or another could be damaging to the student. As we put it in the podcast, what should you do if convincing someone to be Shomer Shabbat would be detrimental or damaging? That led to a fascinating discussion about the nature of the divine will, and Rav Simi's theory that saying, not yet, is a fundamental part of every person's growth towards God, whether they are Baalei Tshuva or have been religious all their lives. I pushed him quite a bit on this point. The results of our back and forth were very interesting, and I expect that many will find them controversial too. This was an enlightening and stimulating conversation, and I'm excited to hear your feedback. We'll get to that discussion in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Originally from Edgware in the UK, Rabbi Simi Lerner now lives in Beit Shemesh, Israel, with his wife Rivka and their 4 sons. He teaches Jewish philosophy at institutions including Midrash Rachel, Midrash Tehillah, Chappelle's, and several online platforms. He also serves as senior educator at L'Man Achai. Rabbi Lerner hosts the podcast Judaism from Within, co-hosts Two Rabbis, Three Opinions, and lectures regularly as part of outreach programs in Tel Aviv. Beyond his educational work, he is a licensed electrician, teaches woodworking, and works part-time as a science teacher at a local primary school. Rabbi Simi Lerner, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You work, Simi, with two different Kiruv organizations, and let's be upfront, Kiruv has a perhaps mixed reputation. And I know that in certain important ways, you tend to move in a different direction from the stereotype. I'm going to open up by asking you, what's a nice Jewish boy like Simi Lerner doing in Kiruv?
I suppose to step back a bit, like if we reflect on what you perhaps might mean by the question, I think we really have to reflect on what we mean by Kiruv, because it's one of those things that people can have many different conceptions in their mind what they mean by that term. So in my daily life, I'm a teacher in different yeshivas and seminaries, and I work as an electrician. Kiruv, or that idea, perhaps has a different area of my life, meaning it's I'm involved in an organization where the title of the organization is known as a Kiruv organization. That's distinct from any other work I do. Even though the reason why I say we have to define it is because a person can say every form of Jewish education is Kiruv. It's a bit of a silly word game then, because, well, karav, to draw close. Excellent, but you're not doing anything. But at the same time, I think everybody, generally speaking, knows what they mean by that term. What they mean by that term is when then a person is disconnected from Judaism and you're drawing them closer. Now, once again, that doesn't mean everybody I teach in yeshiva I'm doing kiruv with in the classical sense. Organizations that in their fundraising is we attract this many people to Judaism. We attract this many people to Judaism. We are present on this many campuses. We are touching and connecting to people who otherwise would have no contact with the Jewish tradition. And we are drawing those close specifically. And in that context, why is a nice Jewish boy like me involved in that? Because it's one of the most noble missions a Jew could be involved with. I mean, you're opening up the opportunity and the potential for someone who is perhaps disconnected from their tradition, either because they've had a bad experience or because their parents were never connected and they never had the opportunity. And you're the one who's going to open that door for them. I mean, how could you not be involved in such a noble task?
That is a very good opening statement. I'm going to dig down on something you said.
Please.
Because you said the Kiruv ultimately is connecting people who are disconnected from Judaism. And obviously, for anyone who is a religious Jew, that is a noble calling. The problem starts to arise potentially when disconnected from Judaism begins to be defined. It could be the person who is, from an Orthodox perspective, not Shomer halacha. From his own perspective is, what do you mean? I am either Shomer halacha, but perhaps in a reform or conservative or other way, or connected to Judaism in other ways. I'm very Zionist. I'm very involved in the Jewish community, even if not through Torah and mitzvot as we would define it. So how do you make sure when talking to people that you're not saying, I want to connect you to Judaism, my form of Judaism, in a way that turns out to be condescending?
That's a great question. When you're dealing with people, you've got to be obviously very sensitive to where people are. And when it comes to different interpretations of Judaism and different ways of expressing Judaism, I think all you can do, and this really allows us to begin, I think the key goal here is to develop a philosophy of Kiruv. And the reason why I say to develop a philosophy of Kiruv is I speak to a lot of people who are moving into the field. And even that language betrays its danger. As I said, Kiruv is on one side, in one broad perspective, is involved whatever I do in education. In the more specific area, it's two organizations I teach for. But when people move into the quote, unquote field, it already starts to betray the danger there. What do you mean the field? You move into the field of banking, you move into the field of being a mechanic. What do you mean in the field of Kiruv? At that point, Kiruv becomes an institution. And the minute anything becomes institutionalized, you run the danger of the people who are funding the institution having specific metrics. And I think that's perhaps where your question is coming from. Because from my point of view, when I'm teaching in, let's think a good example, Midrash Rachel, and I'm teaching students there, they're coming to me because they liked what Midrash Rachel had to offer. Both me and my wife both teach there, and we have both very different ways of approaching Judaism even. Me and my wife, we look at things, I mean, obviously close enough that we get on and can have creative and interesting conversations, but we approach things differently. But we all fit under the framework of what Midrash Rachel is offering, in which case they came to us and we are offering a service. Kiruv is a bit weird because there's no one needs you. No one needs you, in which case you kind of are looking for people. Now, when I say that, I don't go around the place knocking on people's doors. We have an event. The event that I'm in Tel Aviv, for example, we have a dinner and a shir, which means people who hear that we're having a shir, they hear there's food, so there's an incentive to come because something is a little bit interesting, but also there's some dinner that's coming along with it, and they come for the shir, in which case they're still coming to me. How do I not be condescending to people who have come to me Well, that's just a question of character. I'm never condescending to anybody. I give over my lenses of an idea. I'm an educator. I give over my perspective on the world, and they can decide whether they find that perspective attractive or not. If they find my perspective on a topic interesting, they'll approach me and say, well, how does that work in reference to this idea? Or my reform rabbi, how would you relate to them? In which case, hopefully, I'm honest with them without being condescending. Yeah, I think that's perhaps the best way of expressing it. The minute someone's coming to you, you've got to be able to put your perspective on the table and see how they relate to it and react to it.
That's very good. And I like that. There's a lot of important points you made right there. What you said in terms of everything you do is Kiruv, it reminds me a bit of what I once heard in the name of Rav Moshe Feinstein's Zatzal, when he said in Ava Rabbo, we say, Lomod ululamed, that God should help us to learn and to teach. And Rav Moshe says, well, what if you're not a teacher? And he said, there is no such thing. Everybody is a teacher. At every moment of our lives, we are teaching someone something. And I think that's sort of, on some level, what you're talking about. The question is how formalized it becomes. I would like to go and dig down into some of those ideas about metrics and some of the others. When you talk about metrics and institutions, though, how can success be defined in your philosophy of Kiruv? Because part of the problem is defining what it means to be close to God, to be close to Judaism, aside from pure, absolute dedication to Torah and mitzvot. Okay, let's say that that's a successful situation from the perspective of Kiruv. But there's so many other things that are not quite that if someone calls them a failure, that's terrible. They're not failures at all. They're something.
Right. So there's a lot of ideas that I want to put on the table, and just hopefully we can approach it in a systematic way. First of all, I want to say at the outset, it's very easy for someone to be condescending and critical. I've seen many talks where people have been like, the toxic nature of Kiruv, mwahaha. And that's easy, and it's easy to criticize, and it's easy to be a naysayer, and it's easy to do all that sort of like hyperbolic, well, I can criticize. I'm an electrician. I can criticize plumbers all day and all night. I can criticize handymen all day and all night, but I'm not in their position. So I want to put on the table that when I'm involved in this world, and the first thing to recognize is that the minute, perhaps let me approach it from my standpoint, and then we can discuss how other people approach it. The answer is it's like measuring, like measuring love with a stopwatch. You can't. It's like asking a person, did the person keep Shabbos yet? Well, that's maybe not their journey. Maybe that's not the appropriate thing for them in the here and now. And the minute you start putting metrics on it, you start putting pressure on me to perhaps push in that direction. I mean, can you think of anything more dangerous than an individual putting emotional or connective pressure onto someone, and you've developed a relationship with them? And this is a point that just to branch off. When I'm speaking to my students in yeshivas in general, seminaries less so because I'm a male and I'm teaching girls, but when a Jewish teacher isn't a lecturer, we connect to our students. If my students have a question, they can approach me with a question and discuss ideas with me, but the ideas aren't disconnected from their lives. Meaning, even in the educational world, the adult educational world that me and Rivka are involved with, you're not a lecturer. You're connected to your students, their lives, the ideas you're discussing. You're not discussing, I don't know, the symposium and how do you relate to. No, you're talking about things that profoundly affect your lives. So a Jewish educator is far more than a lecturer. When it comes to the world of Kiruv, it's the same, but there's more to it as well, because you're introducing them, hopefully, to a perspective on the world that they haven't had the opportunity to engage with, in which case there is a certain vulnerability there. There is a certain potential for a power imbalance, because you're introducing them to ideas that they haven't come across. A danger that comes along with the Kiruv world is that you've thought of these ideas a lot, you've systemized and structured them, and someone hasn't necessarily come across them, and you sound quite impressive. So at that point, you're developing a relationship with a student who's interested in Judaism. You're connecting with them on the level of learning. Hopefully, it's a level of learning. People do have a thing. I mean, there's different approaches to connecting to students who are distant. With me, it's always in the framework of learning. And most organizations, hopefully, it's always in the framework of learning. But as you said, what happens when there is a metric? And why does there have to be a metric? There has to be a metric on a very basic level. Is because someone's funding the organization. The person who's funding the organization wants to know that, listen, I'm giving you all this money, and what are you doing with it? I mean, you're sitting down and schmoozing to people, but give me some, I want to hear something for that. Now, that's where the danger arises. I mean, it's not because people are nasty or people don't want to recognize that spirituality and free will are central and can't be measured, but then you have the other problem. Back to the idea of institution. The minute you institutionalize anything, you run the risk of asking for metrics. It's an institution. These people are giving money. We want to be able to show them KPIs. And that's where the problem arises. That's where the danger arises, where a person's going to be like, well, I've got this pressure on me. How do I fulfill these arbitrary criteria on real human beings? I run the risk of commodifying people, objectifying people as a tool in my ability to make a living. Can you think of anything more dangerous and deadly and counter to Judaism? That being said, it makes it a very, very sensitive responsibility. Now, as I said, it's easy to be the naysayer and point to people in the world who have done lots of bad things. The way I think the healthiest way of expressing, especially hopefully, that people who are moving into this world, because it is a noble mission, they can not only recognize it as a noble mission, but recognize it as a very delicate responsibility. You're dealing with people's lives here, in which case, if you are getting pressure from an unknown entity within the fundraising world, you as an individual have to have the backbone and the spiritual fortitude to be able to connect to the student where they are and help them and help them progress where you genuinely feel it is best for them to grow and progress. So the answer is, of course, it's a danger. And I'm sure there are dangers in every area of education, meaning seminaries, yeshivas. I want people to come for another year, a second year. For financial reasons, seminaries make a boatload of cash when people come for a second year, and yeshivas as well. In which case, well, what's the motivation? Maybe it would be bad for them, maybe it would be good for them. We hope and we trust, until we have reasons to think otherwise, that these teachers and these educators are working in the best interest of their students. In a very similar way, when it comes to Kiruv, you are involved in a very sensitive responsibility. You're dealing with people's souls. I don't know what we mean by souls in this context. You're dealing with human personalities. And when you're dealing with human personalities, and just to really focus in on this point, and I don't think there is a bigger religious concept, the biggest and the most important religious concept, I think, according to any religious mind, is the idea that we are committed, that we have freedom of the will. And there is nothing more important than that. In which case, that is what you're playing around with. You have the ability to influence. In which case, when you're influencing people, you have to allow the greatest space for them to be in a position to choose in the most objective way possible. And your job is to be able to provide that landscape to them and do your best not to be biased, even if you have personal interests.
I want to talk a little bit more about metrics because I'm curious what you think of the following idea. Perhaps
Please.
What I'm describing here is not called Kiruv, and that's the answer to the question. I'm going to tell you my own idea of if I ever opened up a Kiruv organization. So I used to co-run a yeshiva called Yesodei HaTorah. So I used to think of them as Yesodei houses. It was just a thought experiment. It was never an actual plan. I said, if I wanted to open Yesodei houses, that would be a type of Kiruv place where people could come in and do something. What would it be? What would be the metric, so to speak? And I thought to myself, people would come in and they would learn with a rabbi for an hour or a rebbitzin or an anybody. And they'd sit and they'd learn something that that person found interesting. And if someone were to ask me, did that person become frum? Maybe, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was that a person who wasn't learning Torah now spends 1 hour a week learning Torah. Isn't that a wonderful thing? And if that student were to ask me, if I'm the rabbi, should I be religious? I personally think people should be religious, of course, but there's no game being played over here. There's no secret thing where I'm trying to get you in the back door such that eventually you'll turn into a religious Jew. And I'm playing I have some mechanism where I'm secretly trying to make you I'm very open. Of course, I think you should be Shomer Shabbat, for example. I know we're going to talk about that, if that's true or not, but I think you should be Shomer Shabbat, of course, but we're not talking about that now. There's lots of things that I think, lots of things you think. Our job today is to learn. If that person decides to become a full Shomer Torah U'Mitzvot, wonderful. And if he doesn't, he learned. Isn't that a great thing? Why do I need to have an end goal other than a Jew learned? So what do you think of that concept? Or is that just a Kiruv?
The answer is that's the case in any organization. That's the truth to any organization. What I mean by that is, and by the way, before I carry on, that idea of being open with a student. When I sit down with students, I tell them, and I find it important to do this so we can genuinely connect. I tell students, especially because I teach in Israel and I'm involved in an organization in Israel, a wonderful organization in Tel Aviv. It's called Inspire Tel Aviv. There's only 3 of us, but it's a wonderful organization. It's me, Rabbi Rafal Reiten, and my wife Rivka. And we go there once a week. We go there for Shabbos, and it's really wonderful. I'm always open with the students. I say, you're in Israel right now. And especially this comes up if they're like, what are you doing here? They're asking me, why are you doing this? I'm like, every organization has a want. No such thing as a free lunch, in which case we're all being provided with sushi here tonight. why? And I say to them, if you haven't asked that question, you're not thinking. Why are you being given free food? Why are you here now on a massa program? And they think, well, they kind of think they're sort of like entitled to it, magiali, because I'm Jewish. Think about it. Why is the Israeli government sponsoring you coming here? And they're like, maybe because maybe we'll make aliyah. I said, not maybe. The statistics show you like 40% of you do. So it's a great investment. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them, they have an investment and it makes sense. What do you think my organization wants? What do you think the found? And I said, the answer is, and as I say, I can only speak from my point of view, is that we want to give you the opportunity to connect to your tradition because, like, I would want to connect my children to the tradition. I would want to connect you because you are an extension. You are like my family. You are a Jew. That isn't even talking about religion at that point. I could argue for that on the level of a secular. Secularly speaking, this is a narrative. This is a perspective. This is a framework to meaning, which, as an extension of me, you are a Jew. You are part of my tribe. I want the best for you. On some extended level, I want the best for humanity. But on a more personal level, I want my family, and then the community and my greater community, and you're part of that. That is the reason why I'm sitting here. So I think being open about what you're doing allows you to genuinely connect to your students. Back to your question about like, okay, what are these metrics? Simply speaking, that is the metric of everybody. That is the true metric. I'll explain what I mean by that. Everyone has only that to work with. Because whether a person becomes frum or Shomer Shabbat is so much down to personality and which type of rabbi they connect to or don't connect to. To give you an example, I used to hear these people saying, my rabbi speaks to all the atheists. I also looked at these people and I was like, your rabbi has never spoken to an atheist because the real atheist doesn't want to talk to your rabbi. It's not a question. It's not even interesting. It's just like whatever. It's not like it's not challenging them. They're not struggling with that question. Now, I definitely think you can connect to these people and with articulating Judaism in a specific perspective, you can definitely draw them into Jewish learning. For example, there was a guy in who we were in Tel Aviv in a Shabbos meal. The kid looked like a proper, I don't know what to say. He was there with a tank top, a bunch of earrings, tattoos, and he came up to me and said, "Hello, Rabbi." I'm like, "Hi, how you doing?" He's like, "My name's Elijah, and I'm an atheist." I looked at him and was like, "My friend, you are crying out for someone, my friend. Like, you clearly want to connect to someone." And I knew he wasn't my chill. I'm like, this guy was needed. He needed some spiritualist Aish guy who would show him about, like, I don't know, Buddhism and etc. And that drew him closer to Judaism. There was an avenue that he needed, that he was crying out for. And by that same token, and he became like, I don't know, he started keeping Shabbos or whatever. Who was responsible for that? The answer is nobody. He was on a journey, and different people facilitated him. I'll give you another example. I was learning the Moreh Nevuchim in the middle of Tel Aviv with it was a chabur. It was in the main shul. It was with a couple of students, and this guy came off the street, literally came off the street, sat down, and it developed from the Moira, and he blah 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 blah, and he was in Machon Shlomo, blah blah blah, all the etc. Now, I could, in all my stupidity, say, "Oh, look what I did," and I don't mean that as a point of humility that I'm not stupid enough to say that. It's like you recognize different people have different personalities, and different personalities need different things. And just to connect back to your question, the only genuine metric is a person connected to Jewish learning. If you are able to connect people to Jewish learning on an ongoing way, that comes down to you connecting to the student. That means you keeping up with the student. That means because that is a genuine value that they recognize and you recognize. Now, if a person says, listen, I'm not interested in that, on some level, that's also personality wise. But the thing that you can genuinely push for is that you can genuinely say, I do believe every Jew, secular or religious, should be involved in Jewish education, which means why do they need the other things? There's an inappropriate language for expressing this, but I'll say it in a refined way. The reason why people want to hear keeping Shabbos, keeping kashrus, keeping this, keeping that, keeping the other, is because it sounds more bizam. It sounds cooler. It sounds like you don't go on a metric and say, we've got more people learning. It doesn't sound cool. You want to hear like 3 people went to yeshiva. Now, it doesn't matter if they went in there for a fluffle, and that's where you get the silly game of metrics and games, and like meaning by the same token that the people who ask for metrics, they're asking for games to be played. So what's that? Why do people play with a game where it literally isn't possible? And here's the worst part. If you actually tried to implement these metrics onto people, that would be evil. That would literally be evil. So nobody, I hope, people can't truly believe that, but it sounds cool. It's like,
why would it be evil? Why don't you explain? Why would it be evil?
Because you would be forcing people into your image. You would be forcing people into adopting practices, adopting a worldview, adopting customs, social environments that isn't where they are or should be right now. And you would be forcing that on them because of an external demand.
That leads to the problems of bad habits in Kiruv. Frankly, everything you're saying makes a lot of sense to me on a personal level. And yet, Kiruv does have this sort of mixed reputation, as I said at the opening. What are some of the bad habits? Let's talk about things that people are involved in that they should not be involved in. The kinds of things we should stay away from.
So look, there is another aspect to this. I was never in a situation, even though I worked full time in an organization in the UK, another wonderful organization. I always had a profession behind me. It was never, never education was ever, as I said, I'm a licensed electrician. I've got a job putting up some lights tomorrow. And on Friday I was doing work. It's part of my life. I've got lots of different hats I have to wear and I love all of it. I love electrical work. People think like, oh, Nebuch has to do electrical work. I love being an electrician. It takes off about 10% of my time. The rest, thank God, is teaching because that is obviously I find that more inspiring and I love ideas and I love teaching, I like connecting. But if you don't, and your only income, so to speak, is not education, your income is kiruv. And the reason why that's different is because education, there's a demand for it. There is a demand. This, by the way, this moves on to a whole other idea that people who are involved in kiruv often get paid fairly well because the organization has to set them up with a house. You've got to host people, sets them up with, I want you to work for me full time, in which case you've got to provide for my entire life. You don't want me to be, I don't know, gallivanting on the internet doing web design. You want me to be full time, fully invested into the Kiruv organization in Tennessee, Golders Green, or Brooklyn, in which case the organization funds your life. And you don't walk away with a pot of gold at the end. You don't walk away with a pot of gold. They fund your life, which means if you live in Golders Green, that is a tremendously high salary. Once again, for a demand that doesn't actually exist. There is no demand for your services. And that's why I spoke to a guy in Shul today who was moving to London to work for one of these organizations. And I told him, I said, it's wonderful. They're wonderful people, super genuine. Just don't get high on your own supply. Meaning that's probably the wrong metaphor, but don't believe the myth that this is you. You are being paid a large salary for something that isn't wanted anywhere else in the world because it's an artificial economic system where people are pumping money into it. Nobody's like, guys, we need Kiruv to us. It doesn't make sense. So they have to recognize that. Which, by the way, if it is your income, like many things, there's pressures. That's where the bad habits can emerge. I don't want to say do emerge because hopefully the organizations are rational and normal, and also the person himself when he goes into Kiruv. This is what I tell them, that there is a responsibility you're involved in, but it's a very sensitive responsibility. And when a person knows that he hasn't got taken 4 people to yeshiva, and the organization's like, why would I keep you on board if I can get someone who can do better than you? In which case, and this happened while I was working for one of these organizations, a guy got let loose. Bunch of kids, lovely fellow, and he went to the job center and they were like, oh, so what have you been getting? Like 80, 90,000 pounds. And they're like, no, sorry, mate, you're starting on, I don't know, 15 right now. And that just wasn't possible in his world. And it was crushing. And I said to this guy earlier today, I said to him, just remember, at a certain point, you won't be cool enough for what the organization wants. You have a sell-by date, you have a shelf life, and you have to remember that, unless you want to move into, I don't know, fundraising. So that being said, that's where bad habits emerge. And what do I mean by bad habits? I want to try and make it as broad as possible because I don't want to say it's easy to make it sound like it's just about Kiruv because it's not. It's any organization that has a financial incentive on people's decisions. That the world of marketing is there. So take any. I'll give you a good example here. There was a course were given by. I went to a lecture somewhere about a guy who was talking about Kiruv, and it made me sick to my stomach. His philosophy of Kiruv was that I don't want to use the metaphor because it was really, really horrific. Or maybe I will. Maybe the person will listen. The way he phrased it, and I want this to make clear. I found this so abhorrent. He said he felt his job was plucking off souls on the way to Auschwitz. What did he mean? If it wasn't him saving these souls, these people would burn. That's what he looked at his worldview as. And besides it being abhorrent, it was also profoundly dangerous. Dangerous in the Christian sense of the word, and I'll explain what I mean by that. He would go in detail in the way he would connect to students. And what this man did was every single one of the most sleazy marketing tactics you could possibly imagine. He was basically marketing. But so here's the problem. I'm not blaming him. because he was taught this. He believed it. The same way when you sit opposite a Christian, the Christian who loves you, they're not connecting to you as a person. Their love for you forces them to need you to become Christian. Because if you're not a Christian, you'll burn for eternity. In which case, they need you to be a Christian, which is why I say when a Christian sits opposite you, it's very difficult to genuinely connect because on some level, they want you to be a Christian. And that's coming from love. And this person, because he had, in my opinion, he had a profoundly warped sense of reality, his love for other people, how can I not trick them and whatever it was, I'm saving souls. So what leads to this is, on the one side, I suppose, a warped philosophy of Kiruv, but on the other side is like any other profession that is involved with people, you've got to be very vigilant that you aren't being swayed by the wrong things. And that's the same with education organizations and the same with Kiruv. Does that answer the question a bit?
Definitely answers the question. I'll just make one comment. I want to defend some Christians I know who genuinely don't want to convert Jews. Okay, just in fairness.
For sure. Obviously, 100%. There are those who aren't in that direction, and my point is more on the level of principle. If I genuinely thought a person would, I don't know, suffer for eternity unless they kiss the cross, I mean, like that's what in the ancient time, the Middle Ages, they would allow people to burn. They were doing it in a weird, perverse way out of love for the other person. It's like just kiss the cross. That's all you need to do. And it was like not because they were evil, and well, they were.
Well, they were, but
it was that sort of like perverse,
it didn't come from an evil intention.
Exactly, and that's why one of the reasons why ideas are so important, and thinking through ideas are so important, and challenging ideas are so important.
I'm going to go back to something which I alluded to a few minutes ago. And you've been speaking about it, though we haven't addressed this directly. Doing something to somebody or helping somebody, I'm putting air quotes there in that word helping, in such a way which is not good for them, even though it leads to greater Shmirat Torah. For example, if somebody is in a family where keeping Shabbat would be very bad for them personally, and that person says to you, should I be Shomer Shabbat? There are many people who would say, of course, what do you mean? The Torah says to be Shomer Shabbat. It's chayav skila if you're not Shomer Shabbat. It's a terrible thing not to be Shomer Shabbat. I believe that you think somewhat differently, and perhaps you could elaborate.
Right. So I'm trying to think the best way of approaching this. Because when it comes to, this moves us back to our original point, which is a philosophy of Kiruv. Like, what are you trying to do? What do you think it is your mandate? What do you think it's your responsibility? Or putting it another way in the sense, do you think everybody should be from? Or do you think that people are on a journey and you have a responsibility to be in a position to offer people guidance, perspective along their journey, and their journeys should be taken where they will? And I'm very much on the side of the second. I don't believe that now once again, when I say I don't believe everybody should be from, let's be specific about what I mean by that. Do I think Shabbos is important? Absolutely. And I can articulate a very strict symbolic reason why Shabbos is so fundamental to a meaningful and moral life. And that being said, it might not be a person's journey right now. Now, a person's going to say, well, you think this person shouldn't keep Shabbos? I say that's a trick. That's not a fair question. Do I think on some ultimate utopic future where God is manifest to the universe, that everyone comes to the Lord, the house of the Lord, and proclaims the Yeah, fine, but that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about here and now, everybody should be doing X. And we all know that would be unbelievably detrimental, unhealthy, counterproductive, and just not only all of that, but also so counter to Judaism. People are on journeys. I'm to know where God wants this person to end up. I'm to know where the person who sits down in my involvement with a person in their life, they sit down in a shir and they engage in continuous learning when I say goodbye to them. And then it doesn't take them anywhere. Or the other person, it takes them to, I don't know, marrying someone Jewish, or it takes them to having a more meaningful relationship with their wife and their child. I'm supposed to know what my involvement is supposed to do in their lives. That's the hubris there is profound. No, your job is to do the best you can be and to trust that they take what you've given them in the right direction. Now, I want to say as well, there is also another danger. There's also an element of care here. In which case, if you think a person needs encouragement, a person's like, I'm really thinking about putting on tefillin, but how in the world am I going to do that? I can't do that. The answer you say, well, you can advise them as best you can. And sometimes you may feel they need to be encouraged because you actually genuinely think it's a good thing for them to keep put on tefillin every morning. In which case, once again, back to my point, a very delicate responsibility on both sides. You need to err on the side of caution on both sides, but at the same time, not be so cautious that you become like, I don't know, a tape recorder. Once again, it's sensitive, but I think if you appreciate the dangers on both sides, either of not encouraging or encouraging, you appreciate the dangers. You appreciate the means you're engaging in for a noble end. But if you appreciate the potential darkness of your means, I think you become a different type of person who engages in this. And I think that's one of the most important points about appreciating means and ends. Yes, sometimes means can be suspect and can be grey, but there's two approaches. One, ignore that aspect and just go for it. The other one is sit with it, recognize the responsibility. It might be scary to do that, but you become a different type of person who engages in it if you do it like that.
Now, Rav Simi, what you're saying really speaks to me in a deep kind of way. And I'm going to say a certain philosophy that I have developed, maybe philosophy is giving it too much weight, but a certain way of thinking how I think about these particular things. I'm curious if you agree. It's the philosophy behind the things you're saying. And to me, on some level, I would describe it like this, which is that halacha, Torah, is the will of God. It is completely the will of God. However, the will of God is not identical to the Torah, meaning the will of God is a bigger thing than the Torah. It is not equivalent to it. It is not synonymous with it. In other words, I can say that everything in Jewish law is an expression of the will of God. That does not mean inherently that anything not in Jewish law is not the will of God. They're not synonymous. And in my mind, what you're saying is kind of like that, and maybe you'll say that's not what you mean. There are times when something which might be technically outside the bounds of religious law, can I say that is a valid application of halacha if it's not? Of course not. It is not a valid application of halacha. But can I judge someone and say, by definition, because you are breaking halacha, you are by definition at odds with God? I wouldn't say that either, because that's not my place to do so, and I don't think it's necessarily true. I'm wondering if you agree or disagree with that particular statement.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. So let me think about it from this standpoint. I think it was Franz Rosenzweig who phrased an idea that when someone asked him, he was like a non-orthodox Orthodox philosopher, very interesting fellow, fascinating thinker, and he was going to convert to Christianity, and then he connected to Judaism. And at a certain point in his life, began more Jewish practice, and someone said to him, Herr Rosenzweig, do you put on tefillin? And he said, not yet. And this is an example I give to my students when they ask me questions like, how can you pretend I don't have to do this right now? I said, every single Jew has a not yet. Not yet isn't no. Not yet is not yet, meaning there is an appreciation of a pressure. And I think that pressure of not yetness unifies every single Jew. Every single Jew from across the spectrum is under the canopy of not yet. And that is just a truth. You cannot live without not yetness, otherwise you would be doing everything. So I think if we look at that, if we appreciate that, okay, everyone is at some point not doing everything, and it is the will of God, hopefully, for us to engage in our lives, then that means everybody on some level is necessarily not living up to halacha.
By definition, of course.
In which case, then I think what you're saying is true. The answer is it the will of God for us to grow and progress? Absolutely. But how is growth and progress possibly the will of the Almighty if you have to be doing everything immediately? The answer is that's a balance there. That's a tension. There's a tension of there is a framework, and I'm supposed to try and exist within this framework. If I then say, if he would have said, do you plant space? Say, no, I had no intention to. Yeah, that's breaking the framework. Not yetness allows you to exist within that framework. And I think that's perhaps the same way, just putting it in a bit of a story world framework. The idea that like everyone is unified by a not yetness. And that is an ideal. That is not the way they would put it. It's not a bug, that's a feature of the system. A feature of the system is that you will not be doing everything right now. And a lot of people, especially people who have like very black and white thinking, find that so profoundly difficult to be able to connect to. They're like, what do you mean I don't have to go to shul? You're saying you don't have to go to shul? I'm like, no, but you might want to take a break for a bit. Maybe take a break. Don't not do anything, but take a bit of a break. It seems like that might be what you need right now. Now, I can say that to myself. If someone's asking for advice, I can try to do my best to give advice. But and also I would stress as well that when it comes to more stricter areas of Jewish law, definitely take advice about how best to articulate something. Don't tell people Shabbos isn't important. Don't be silly about it, because we do consider these ideas very central, very important. And humility is hopefully something that I've been emphasizing, is that there are people who are more knowledgeable and more articulate in this area. So, for example, one of Rivka's students, I know she was a Catholic who was becoming Jewish, and she had converted, and she was like very in her Catholic mentality and described herself as a vessel, and it was like very, very Catholic language. And she wanted to start keeping everything right then and there. And we were working in the JLE at the moment, so we asked one of the JLE have different hierarchies of Rabbonim, and he said right now they shouldn't be keeping Shabbos. It's not a good idea for them. It was a situation, we asked a specific Rav in a specific context, said in this situation, it's not right for her. It's not healthy. Her trajectory was like, this isn't what she needs right now. And a person could be like, how can you say such a thing? And the answer is, clearly this Rav was looking at things from a broader perspective. Health, mental stability are all part of the story as well. And this situation, as I said, this situation called for a specific response. Not yetness.
So not yet is an excellent answer. In fact, it reminds me a bit of something which I once read in the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It was a book by Herbert Wiener, who was a Reform rabbi who interviewed Jewish mystics, one of whom was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And that's the most interesting part of the book, in my opinion. And he had private audiences with the Rebbe at like 3 a.m. several times. It was very, very interesting. And at one point, the Lubavitcher Rebbe wanted to talk to him about some writings that Rabbi Wiener had written about Reform Judaism. And I'll paraphrase the Rebbe's response. He said, people think the difference between us being presumably Chabad or Orthodoxy, and Reform is that you compromise and we don't compromise. And the Rebbe said, that's not true. We compromise as well. The difference is, however, we don't sanctify the compromise. In other words, as opposed to saying, Shabbos is too hard, so don't keep Shabbos. It's mutter for you not to keep Shabbos. Shabbos no longer exists for you. We'll say, okay, how about we try again in a month? How about we try again next year? Which is essentially what you're saying, the not yetness. It's not that we're saying that you can't compromise. We're saying, however, don't pretend the compromise is the ideal situation.
Yep. No, for sure. It's a beautiful way of putting it.
But on the other hand, I think it also, however, avoids certain situations. I'm going to give you an example of that.
Sure.
Okay. There was a time on my other podcast, Intimate Judaism, where my co-host Tali and I interviewed 2 people about, and this is a theoretical situation. Let's say, for example, a woman is having a very, very difficult day. This is not a case of mental illness. This is not a case of depression, but she's just very sad, had a very, very difficult day. She's also in nida, which means her husband is not allowed to touch her, but she really needs a hug. And as I remember it, one of the 2 people there said, of course, halacha will find a way to make that allowed. Essentially. Of course it's allowed according to halacha, we'll find some way. And the other person, who was more right-wing, said, no, halacha probably can't find a way to make that allowed, but maybe you should do it anyway. Again, paraphrasing, and I don't want to say they actually said that. People should listen to that episode in case I'm saying it incorrectly. That's what I got out of it. And to me, the second approach is the more truthful approach, because halacha is a very specific system. We must treat halacha with a certain degree, with absolute, I should say, integrity. This is a system where we can't bend it to our will. That doesn't mean there can't be compromises, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But sometimes, perhaps, the will of God in a given situation might include doing something that is outside the technical bounds of halacha. Now, I realize this can be a tremendously slippery slope, because I can start saying all sorts of things. Well, I'm sure God is okay if I eat this hamburger now that's not kosher, because it requires a huge degree of honesty. It's a very, very dangerous position to take, but I don't necessarily think that it's wrong. And because it's so dangerous, I wouldn't recommend that people do this as a matter of course. It should be avoided as much as possible. I guess the specific ramification might be, in a certain sense, if that person did hug his wife because she was so upset, and that was that. Does that mean that on Yom Kippur he has to klap al chet for that? Or is that not something for which he has to do tshuva? That's really my question. I'm curious what you think about that.
So it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one. It reminds me, I think it was, I'm not quoting this correctly, obviously, but first of all, I think this applies also in the area of Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy. A person can say some ideas are beyond the pale. It depends what they mean by that. Any idea can be discussed. Any idea can be entertained. Any idea can be discussed. But the minute you institutionalize it, you destroy the system. I think it was Rabbi Louis Jacobs who, towards the end of his life, he sort of wrote a letter to somebody where he basically said that, like, I opened the door to dismantling halacha for all intents and purposes. I opened the door to us not taking it as this movable structure, the minute I opened it a crack, I couldn't close it anymore. And that perhaps is your point when the person says that, listen, I'm and I'm not going to say that God would want you to, because I don't know what that means. I think you could say that what so once again, if I was in a situation, can I envision a situation where what I would do wouldn't be in line with halacha? I mean, of course, it's called not living up to your values. We all do it. We all don't live up to our values. That's why we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The person who gave a hug to his wife, hopefully, when it came to Rosh Hashanah, he would think about how can we be the type of couple who can change that and in the future, etc., etc. That's the point of Judaism. Judaism has never said that it's a you either achieve it or you failed. It's like, no, it is a process. It is a building, like the minute you institutionalize, or the language you use, you sanctify it, you've now made it part of the structure. In which case, why would I say sorry? Why would I say sorry? Why would I try and grow? The answer is this couple, on some level, whenever they're ready, would be able to grow. And what does that mean, to grow? It means whatever it means in their particular context. But does that mean that everyone on some level isn't doing that as well? Of course they are. It's called being Jewish. It's called being alive and being Jewish. And in a weird way, if you're not in any way being challenged and at times failing, you're not living. You live, they say a ship is safe at shore in the docks or whatever. It's supposed to go out and you'll be challenged and you'll make a mistake. And this isn't about making a mistake, actually. This is about consciously deciding, I can't do this right now. And guess what? That's a decision you have to make. And sometimes if you would have forced yourself to do the thing that you thought at the time was right, that you might be irreversibly damaged. I think that's why I want to go back to the idea that your free will decision is central here. And here's the thing, however dark it may sound, the decision any of us make in these contexts, we have to own that decision and try and grow. But yeah, of course, by definition, you're going to have to make these sort of compromises. It's called being alive and living with it's also, by the way, it's the nature of law. Law doesn't care. It's like law is I think I've forgotten the metaphor they use, but law doesn't care. Law is structure. Law is doesn't move. Obviously, there's examples where within Jewish thought and Jewish law, there's certain compromises, but to pretend that where there's a will, there's a rabbi's way, I've forgotten how the thing is. I think that's very unhealthy. No, law is law. Sometimes you don't live up to law. Sometimes you don't live up to your values, and that's called
I think
being
it's
alive.
where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way.
There you go. There you go. There you go. No, there's sometimes you don't live up to your values, and that's called being alive, and it's okay to accept it. And the people who are very black and white thinking, unfortunately, they struggle tremendously with this, where they can hear like, how can you not daven with a minyan? But doesn't the halacha say you have to? And the answer is like, yeah, but not right now. Does that mean it's now you don't? I mean, like, no, maybe I'm not going to go to mincha right now. I'm not. Even though they're like, so I'm saying that's called being alive. That's called living Judaism. So yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to decide. I'll go for it. I'm going to push it in the most difficult way I know possible. This is something from Rav Shagar.
Please.
I don't know if you're someone who reads Rav Shagar.
I don't, but I tried to once. Holy mackerel. It wasn't easy.
Talk about a slippery slope. But it's a fascinating story. I'm going to say it anyway. There is technically a law on the books, which I'll say at the outset is not implemented in practice, which is that the law of Shabbat, of saving a life, only applies to Jewish people who can then keep Shabbat again, but does not technically apply to non-Jews. There are ways of getting out of it, which halacha does. Okay, so this is not a practical situation. However, in theory, if someone sees a non-Jew and can save them on Shabbat and needs to break Shabbat to do so, there's a halachic problem with that. Let me just leave it like that. Rav Shagar was approached by a student, a very religious student, who was very upset with himself. And he said, I really have to work on my belief, my emunah, because I know myself, if I saw a non-Jew who needed help on Shabbat and I would have to break Shabbat for it, I would do it. Therefore, there's something wrong with my appreciation of Torah and my emunah and my belief. Now, Rav Shagar then said, I could have told him that halachically he'd be right, but that was not the point. Let's assume the basic halacha without getting into the ways that halachicists get out of it. Rav Shagar writes that he deliberated in his mind what to answer him, and the answer he gave him was the following. He said, do you really think that it's the will of God that non-Jew should die rather than you breaking Shabbos? With the implication being, clearly not. That would be morally terribly problematic. And that's basically the end of the story. Now, Of course, the problem is if we do that, we can say, is it really the will of God for anything? And in that situation, it's very difficult to say that Rav Shagar meant not yet, or that if he saved him, okay, hopefully next time he'll do better, quote unquote, and not save him. I think most of us would find that morally abhorrent. And by the way, Rav Soloveitchik himself, once in discussing this issue, explained why halachically, technically, the law doesn't apply. And when asked further, he said that the technical way we get out of the problem satisfies him halachically. It works halachically, but he acknowledged it doesn't satisfy him morally. He's still bothered by the morality of the law that's on the books. What do you say to that?
So there's a couple of things. I think it's from David C. Hoffman who discussed this in like the way he phrases it. He says like technically you shouldn't be allowed to save a Jew. His point is that it's like an equal Jew and non-Jew, but then there's an extra. That's where he tries to make sense of a non-implementable situation. It's like no one should be able to be saved. But how to maybe the way I would, it's very.
I'm really putting you on the spot over here. It's not really fair, but I appreciate you looking.
No, please. I can tell you my thoughts that come to mind. Because it's like not classic apologetics, like how do I make sense of that? How do I defend that? But like some thoughts that come to mind is that what does it mean? Do we the type of personality who struggles with such a halacha? I think is a very Jewish personality. I think we are supposed to struggle with these personalities. We are supposed to be the Avram who sees Sodom being destroyed, and he is in a moral panic, and he approaches God, and that God doesn't look at him and say, "What are you talking about? I said I'm going to smash him. What are you fetching about?" No, God relates to him on that level, and the level of like, no, there's no good people there. And the same way when Avram is told that you've got to go kill your son, it's like a test. Why is it a test? Because you don't kill your kids. And that same token, I think, is it the will of God that a person should struggle with such a halacha? I think yes. Of course. Now, a person can say, it's not, as you said, it's never implementable. It's on the books. What does it mean? How would it actually come back? Okay, these are all interesting ways of getting out of it because but you should struggle. Everyone should read that and struggle. Now, a person can say, but no, I've sat into the importance of what Shabbos represents, creation, meaning, all this sort of things. Like, that's lovely. But if you don't struggle with this, there's something very un-Jewish about you. That's not me. This one's a level of values. I'm saying that you should struggle with this. This should be something that makes you uncomfortable. The same way next week's parsha, we're discussing about the wars with the Midianites. That should make you struggle. And it's not that, and as a person, I'm like, yeah, but I'm not asked to do that now. Fair.
I find that the most troubling parsha in the Chumash, actually.
So we could discuss that. But it is, and here's the thing, and it should be. It should be. And guess what? If you were told tomorrow that you should do that, and a person says, like, I just know my commitment to Judaism doesn't let me do that. Like, how that's supposed to be implemented in history, I have no idea. We're not asked to do that. Let me phrase it this way. That isn't a Judaism any of us were asked to accept, interestingly enough. We're not asked that isn't part of Judaism today. In which case, that's not a lived part of my Jewish life. But you should really struggle with that. And my point isn't people think like, oh, my Western values. No, my Jewish values make me struggle with that. And it's like when I tell people, when a person like this is something that always comes up, especially in the Kiruv world, to connect it to Kiruv. There's another method of people doing Kiruv. For some bizarre reason, there is a personality type that is attracted to a really charif, I don't even want to call it charif because that gives it credence, a really dark expression of Kiruv, where the people use loads of Kabbalistic demons and really disgusting language and really abhorrent perspectives. And here's what they do. They say, you're uncomfortable with that? It's because you're Western, influenced by the Western mass media. It's etc. So I said the way I say to them is like, all right, first thing I say, if that really was Judaism, I would reject it. I would find it my moral responsibility to rebel against such a demon. First things first, I do that for the bit of the rhetorical flair there. I believe in it 100%.
But you mean it. That's fair.
Oh, yeah, because what people do is, I say to the people who say, well, then people say to me that, because when I say that, when people say, well, maybe that is Judaism. Maybe his dark conception of God really is what Judaism is. I say, well, I wash my hands of the affair then. That would be something that would be immoral to engage in. I don't care if you put God's name behind it. The same way in another conversation, it's like the idea of like, just because someone says God doesn't mean that's what I mean by God. I don't consider what Hamas mean by God what I mean by God. It's like no, sorry, I'm not playing in that game. But in reference to and looking at the idea of, okay, how does this affect my life? The very values that got all these people in Kiruv attracted to Judaism, the idea of Judaism's love, the idea of Judaism's moral profundity, the radical approach Judaism took throughout history. You can't go then at the end when they're involved and be like, by the way, that's all just fluff. It's really this like bizarre, backwards. No, no, no. What you brought me here with was all this beautiful stuff. And I think that's genuinely true. So when it comes to actually implementation, the situation of Reb Shagar, what could he mean by that if we fit it into this framework? Do I really think it's the will of God for you not, this isn't what he said, but this is the way I would phrase it, that you shouldn't struggle? Of course you should struggle. Should you become the type of person who the human life and human connection is meaningless in relationship to breaking Shabbos? No.
That is an excellent answer. I really appreciate that. When you talk about that idea, you didn't really mean it because you said that's not what Kiruv is, but I think it's something which actually does take place where people are brought in by something. And later on, they might have some sort of buyer's remorse where what they actually have is not what they were necessarily told by their quote unquote Kiruv professional. I have heard some people who are religious and they've remained religious and they're Balei Tshuva. They came into the Orthodox community after being originally not part of it, but they were told certain things in their Baal Tshuva yeshiva, and it wasn't necessarily what life was really like later on. And I'm curious how you avoid, I guess the answer is honesty, but avoid that phenomenon of people discovering that something isn't exactly what they thought it was going to be. There are all sorts of things that seem so great, their first Shabbos or their first Jewish wedding. Fantastic. And life is a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, no. So, by the way, I want to also stress there's a huge amount of self-sacrifice that goes on the level of people involved in this, a huge amount of honesty, chesed, giving, and there's an absolute, because when we're discussing the darker sides of things, there's a danger that we don't focus in on the absolute amazing work that people do in the most genuine way to connect Jewish people to their heritage and their a framework of meaning in a world today where narrative and a lack of narrative and lack of perspective and coherence, and people are striving and sort of thirsty for a direction. So there's a huge amount of that. With that being said, how do you approach this whole buyer's remorse thing? Is that it is, I always say that two things to add to that. It's like, it's very, like, people like bringing people to very wealthy, fancy people's houses for Shabbos meals. And it's like rich people love hosting people, and they love hosting Kiruv people, and love hosting people who are secular. But like, that's not reflective of a regular Jewish life. And also, you don't get your tefillin for free in life. You don't get this for free, that for free, that no. So there's a huge danger that in the financial side, but the financial side has manifestations in many other areas. If you're living a religious life and you're financially struggling, and all these things, and marriage and life and people and friends, and also the way you described it in the Kiruv world, and then you get funneled into a more Haredi perspective that doesn't have all the flair of the Kiruv organization, and then you're like kind of stuck, but you kind of got married, and then God help you. Yeah, simply speaking, I have to go down to the point of honesty. There's a danger that I suppose there's a broader point as well, which is the danger of you drawing people closer to their tradition. And I'm using the language like that because how they live out their individual personality in relationship to Judaism may not be the way you will. And from my point of view, when I'm engaging with people who have a more I don't find the Kabbalistic framework spiritually like inspiring, which is great. It's not for everybody. But if I have a student who's like super into that, either I have to provide it for them, or I have to say, look, I'm not the right person to ask. I'm not the right person to connect to. In which case, I pass them on to someone else. In which case, but wait a minute, they'll do. That's the answer. If it's part of the tradition and it's not my approach, that has to be okay.
Very good. And I have one more question about regrets. And one of them involves something very specific. You might say this is not something you've seen or experienced. There's a particular line, this is my particular pet peeve, that is often used in Kiruv. At least I have heard people say it's often used in Kiruv. I'm not a Kiruv teacher myself. It's not something which I've dealt with any organization. It's frequently said, Judaism is a religion of questions. Ask anything you want. Nothing's off limits. That's true. Except that it doesn't mean that the answer could be anything you want. Here's an example of what I mean. Let's say someone says, ask away. Anything is on the table. So you say, yes, I'm bothered by certain questions of academic biblical study, biblical criticism, etc. What about the following contradiction? So the rabbi answers, well, Rashi says this, and this explains the contradiction. You say, well, that's not convincing to me. You say, okay, well, the Ramban says this, and this explains the contradiction. And the person says, no, that still doesn't work for me. And ultimately, okay, I've asked all my questions, and now I'm going to say that I don't believe that this was given to us by God. Well, that's not an acceptable answer. You have to accept the answers I gave you, because otherwise you're violating one of the principles of faith. You see, questions can be asked as long as you accept the answers. Meaning, religion of questions is true, but it's within a framework that we're going to accept certain parameters and certain frameworks which are part of the Jewish story. In other words, it's one thing at the Pesach Seder, you can ask anything you want. Of course, that's true. It's one thing in a shir, you can ask anything you want. But a Rebbe's not going to accept, if you're learning Baba Basra, why do I know that Baba Basra is true in the first place? That's not part of the you can ask anything, generally. And that applies to Kiruv as well. I'm curious how you would deal with something like that and that issue.
So it's a great question, and there are different levels where questions can take place. For example, and I don't mean, and I find it like I don't like the language that a person is more advanced than someone else, in the sense that they don't need to. I find it could be my biases. My area is philosophy, and I think both secular and religious philosophy I mean, they're central to my life. So when a person says like questions about God, they've moved past that. No one has ever moved past that. That's an important point to make. But that being said, within the context of a lived Jewish tradition, the question whether God exists, that question is not legitimate. What I mean by that is we can discuss whether God exists, but we can't let that question into the framework of a lived Jewish tradition, because a lived Jewish Orthodox tradition is based off certain assumptions. You don't have to believe those assumptions. This is an idea that I think is not explicitly developed by Rav Hirsch in the 19 letters. I think it's an implicit point he's making. Was brought to light to me by Rabbi Simi Lerner. The idea that when Rav Hirsch invites the person to perceive in the 19 letters, letter 1 is the complaint, letter 2 is the reply, the first reply before Rav Hirsch develops a worldview. He invites the person to look at Judaism from its standpoint. And he doesn't even ask him, believe. And this was Gretz's criticism, but I think he missed the point. He doesn't ask him to believe it. He says, let's pretend. Let's look at Judaism from its standpoint. Let's look at creation as a symphony, the Jewish people, humanity. Let me paint for you this picture, and then see if you appreciate this worldview. Is this a noble position you want to take? If it is, adopt it. See the world through these lenses. If not, throw stones at it. And a person says, well, what about God's existence? It's like, right. Even if a person isn't in a position where they're ready to accept that God exists, you can still look at Judaism as a narrative. You can still see its story. But then, wait a minute, I want to argue whether God exists or not. That is almost beside the point. I can have that conversation with you, and you may not ever get a satisfactory answer for that. But then, while you're living within the Jewish tradition, guess what? The world you perceive is a creative reality. But is it a creative reality? We can debate that. But from within Judaism, it most certainly is. In which case, we have to appreciate the levels of the question. So I think that's perhaps a good way of phrasing it. I think in another context, discussing the Israel and Israel society and Israel and Zionism, can I ask the question or debate the question about the authenticity of Israel's existence from within a Zionistic perspective? It's like, no, that's not quite an area where the question makes sense. That is working with that as an assumption. Now, I want to stress, I don't mean it's true in the sense, I don't think God definitely does exist. Well, that's a question that we can develop and we can talk about. But within the Jewish vision of the world, it's part of it. It's not a belief. It's part of the reality you're perceiving. Is it justified? That's where the question can take place. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. In fact, it does dovetail with something I've been reading recently in, again, Rav Shagar, but in his explanations of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov's Likutei Moharan. So Rav Shagar, in explaining Rabbi Nachman's ideas, says that every person should have his own personal tzimtzum, hollowing out a space inside of him, just as there's divine contraction in the world, hollowing out a space, and then inserting into that space in your heart a positive view of the world, looking at the world through positive lenses. And in so doing, you will have a greater belief in God. Because by doing this, by accenting and emphasizing the positive, the godly aspects of existence, that's what you will see. Of course, he says, you will be sacrificing a sense of totality because you're not looking at everything anymore. You are trying to essentially ignore those things that contradict this perspective. But we all do that anyway. The question is, are you doing it consciously or it's happening regardless of what you want to do? So he says, choose to accent and emphasize the positive, seeing the world through godly eyes, through eyes that accept the divine is in the world. And in so doing, that will be the reality that you live in. You will actually live in a more godly world. doesn't make it less authentic just because you're choosing. Everyone decides to accent certain things and to emphasize certain
Make
things.
certain
Anyway,
things relevant and certain things foreground and background. And yeah,
exactly.
for sure.
Exactly. Okay, Rav Simi, this is so interesting. I'm really enjoying it, and I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of it. If they were to ask, where does Rav Simi get his ideas from? What are the books that he might recommend? Who are the thinkers that he would suggest that they read to see more about the worldview that he has developed? What would you recommend they read?
So it's a tricky one, and this is a whole nother kettle of fish, perhaps for a different time. I don't really read. I'm very dyslexic, so I don't read anybody. The only person I read is on Shabbos, so I listen to a lot. And there are different thinkers that I can recommend people to go to. Like, obviously, one of my biggest influences is a combination of Rav Shamshon and Raphael Hirsch, the Kuzari, and the Rambam. And Rav Sadia Gaon. Those are the places I spend a lot of time. And personally, how do I read them? Well, first of all, they were all written in Arabic, in which case English translation is just great. But the answer is I put them through speech synthesizer and I do a lot of listening. So those are four things that I spend a lot of time as foundations to be able to approach the world. And then there are different thinkers. I can just think of like both religious and secular. I can't think of any particular books because I said I don't read books per se. I listen to lectures by different people and different times and different topics. So I can't really think off the hand of a different thinker that I'll give you one like from the Gush, one person I've recently been spending a lot of time with, a rabbi called Rabbi Ezra Bick. Phenomenal thinker. Like I've been absolutely blown away by his approach, his ideas, the development of his perspective. I probably could come up with a bunch more, but that was someone I've recently been investing more time with. Also because he has a lot of stuff on audio and that works for my brain. Yeah, probably other people have a list of books, but I suppose Rav Hirsch is really the one that really
He gives you the most spiritual sustenance, you're saying.
Yeah, like Rivka tells me when she sees like after I've read Rav Hirsch, I'm like lit up. It's I say it's my Judaism has very much been inspired and enlightened by Rav Hirsch. So that's probably the one that I would say you go to first and then develop backwards.
Rav Simi, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise, it was an absolute pleasure.
I'm excited to have everyone listen to this. Thank you for joining me today.
My absolute pleasure.
We say Tehillim all the time, in moments of fear, hope, and gratitude. But have you ever stopped to ask, what makes Tehillim so powerful? We've all been told these words are holy, that they carry unique spiritual weight, that they were written with divine inspiration. But why? What is it about these words that has made them a cornerstone of Jewish life for thousands of years? That's the question the podcast Tehillim Unveiled sets out to explore. Each episode takes one of the most familiar chapters and unpeels it layer by layer, revealing its structure, emotion, and timeless meaning. In the latest episode, Dr. Yael Ziegler joins the show to explore how Tehillim captures the heartbreak of Tisha B'Av and the quiet hope that follows. Tehillim Unveiled. Find the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.